Profession by Isaac Asimov, pages 38 to 44. There was, of course, no way anyone in the audience could tell how any contestant was progressing except for whatever notations went up on the notice board. But then, that didn't matter. Except for what professional metallurgists there might be in the audience, none would understand anything about the contest professionally in any case. What was important was who won, who was second, who was third. For those who had bets on the standings, illegal but unpreventable, that was all important. Everything else might go hang. George watched as eagerly as the rest, glancing from one contestant to the next, observing how one had removed the cover from his microspectrograph with deft strokes of a small instrument, how that one was peering into the face of the thing, how still a third was setting his alloy bar into its holder, and how a fourth adjusted a vernier with such small touches that he seemed momentarily frozen. Trevelyan was as absorbed as the rest. George had no way of telling how he was doing. The notice board over contestant 17 flashed. Focus plate out of adjustment. The audience cheered wildly. Contestant 17 might be right, and he might, of course, be wrong. If the latter, he would have to correct his diagnosis later and lose time. Or he might never correct his diagnosis and be unable to complete his analysis. Or, worse still, end with a completely wrong analysis. Never mind. For the moment, the audience cheered. Other boards lit up. George watched for board 12. That came on finally. Sample holder, off center. New clamp depressor needed. An attendant went running to him with a new pan. If Trevelyan was wrong, it would mean useless delay. Nor would the time elapsed in waiting for the pan be deducted. George found himself holding his breath. Results were beginning to go up on board 17 in gleaming letters. Aluminum, 41.2649. Magnesium, 22.1914. Copper, 10.1001. Here and there, other boards began sprouting figures. The audience was in bedlam. George wondered how the contestants could work in such pandemonium, then wondered if that were not even a good thing. A first-class technician could work best under pressure. 17 rose from his place at his board, went red-rimmed to signify completion. 4 was only 2 seconds behind him. Another, then another. Trevelyan was still working, the minor constituents of his alloy bar still unreported. With nearly all contestants standing, Trevelyan finally rose also. Then, tailing off, 5 rose and received an ironic cheer. It wasn't over. Official announcements were naturally delayed. Time elapsed was something, but accuracy was just as important. And not all diagnoses were of equal difficulty. A dozen factors had to be weighed. Finally, the announcer's voice sounded. Winner in the time of 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Diagnosis correct. Analysis correct within an average of 0.7 parts per 100,000. Contestant number 17, Henry Anton Schritt of... What followed was drowned out in the screaming. Number 8 was next, then 4, whose good time was spoiled by a 5-part in 10,000 error in the Nobium figure. 12 was never mentioned. He was an also-ran. George made his way through the crowd to the contestant's door and found a clot of humanity ahead of him. There would be weeping relatives, joy or sorrow, depending, to greet them. Newsmen to interview the top scorers or the hometown boys, autograph hounds, publicity seekers, and just the plain curious. Girls, too, who might hope to catch the eye of a top scorer almost certainly headed for Novia, or perhaps a low scorer who needed consolation and had the cash to afford it. George hung back. He saw no one he knew. We're at the top of page 40. He saw no one he knew. With San Francisco so far from home, it seemed pretty safe to assume that there would be no relatives to console with Trev on the spot. Contestants emerged, smiling weakly, nodding at shouts of approval. Policemen kept the crowds far enough away to allow a lane for walking. Each high score drew a portion of the crowd off with him, like a magnet pushing through a mound of iron fillings. When Trevelyan walked out, scarcely anyone was left. George felt somehow that he had delayed coming out until just that had come to pass. There was a cigarette in his dour mouth, and he turned, eyes downcast, to walk off. It was the first hint of home George had had in what was almost a year and a half, and seemed almost a decade and a half. He was almost amazed that Trevelyan hadn't aged, that he was the same Trev he had last seen. George sprang forward. "Trev!" Trevelyan spun about, astonished. He stared at George, and then his hand shot out. George Clayton. What the devil? And as soon as a look of pleasure had crossed his face, it left. His hand dropped before George had quite a chance of seizing it. "Were you in there?" A curt jerk of Trev's head indicated the hall. "I was." "To see me?" "Yes." "Didn't do so well, did I?" He dropped his cigarette and stepped on it, staring off into the street, where the emerging crowd was slowly eddying and finding its way into skimmers, while new lines were forming for the next scheduled Olympics. Trevelyan said heavily, "So what? It's only the second time I missed. Novia can go shove after the deal I got today. There are planets that would jump at me fast enough. But listen, I haven't even seen you since Education Day. Where did you go? Your folks said you were on special assignment, but gave no details, and you never wrote. You might have written." This is the top of page 41. "I should have," said George uneasily. "Anyway, I came to say I was sorry the way things went just now." "Don't be," said Trevelyan. "I told you, Novia can go shove." At that, I should have known. They've been saying for weeks that the Beeman machine would be used. All the wise money was on Beeman machines. The damned education tapes they ran through me were for Henslers. And who uses Henslers? The worlds in the Goman cluster, if you want to call them worlds. Wasn't that a nice deal they gave me? Can't you complain to? Don't be a fool. They'll tell me my brain was built for Henslers. Go argue. Everything went wrong. I was the only one who had to send out for a piece of equipment. Notice that? They deducted time for that, though. Sure. But I lost time wondering if I could be right in my diagnosis when I noticed there wasn't any clamp depressor in the parts that they'd supplied. They don't deduct for that. If it had been a Hensler, I would have known I was right. How could I match up then? The top winner was a San Franciscan. So were 3 of the next 4, and the 5th guy was from Los Angeles. They get big city education tapes. The best available. Beeman spectrographs and all. How do I compete with them? I came all the way out here just to get a chance at a Novian-sponsored Olympics in my classification, and I might just as well have stayed home. I knew it, I tell you, and that settles it. Novia isn't the only chunk of rock in space. Of all the damned... He wasn't speaking to George. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was just uncorked and frothing. George realized that. George said, "If you knew in advance that the Beemans were going to be used, couldn't you have just studied up on them?" "They weren't in my tapes, I tell you." "You could have read books." The last word trailed off under Trevelyan's suddenly sharp look. Trevelyan said, "Are you trying to make a big laugh out of this? You think it's funny? How do you expect me to read some book and try to memorize enough to match someone else who knows?" "Well, I thought..." "You try it. You try." Then suddenly, "What's your profession, by the way?" He sounded thoroughly hostile. Well, come on now. If you're going to be a wise guy with me, let's see what you've done. You're still on Earth, I notice, so you're not a computer programmer, and your special assignment can't be much. George said, Listen, Trev, I'm late for an appointment. He backed away, trying to smile. No, you don't. Trevelyan reached out fiercely, catching hold of George's jacket. You answer my question. Why are you afraid to tell me? What is it with you? Don't come here rubbing a bad showing in my face, George, unless you can take it too. Do you hear me? He was shaking George in frenzy, and they were struggling and swaying across the floor when the voice of doom struck George's ear in the form of a policeman's outraged call. All right now, all right, break it up. George's heart turned to lead and lurched sickeningly. The police would be taking names, asking to see identity cards, and George lacked one. He would be questioned, and his lack of profession would show at once. And before Trevelyan, too, who ached with the pain of the drubbing he had just taken, would spread the news back home as a salve for his own hurt feelings. George couldn't stand that. He broke away from Trevelyan and made a run, but the policeman's heavy hand was on his shoulder. Hold on there. Let's see your identity card. Trevelyan was fumbling for his, saying harshly, I'm Amand Trevelyan, metallurgist, non-ferrous. I was just competing in the Olympics. You better find out about him, though, officer. George faced the two, lips dry and throat thickened past speech. Another voice sounded. Quiet, well-mannered. Officer, one moment. The policeman stepped back. Yes, sir. This young man is my guest. What is the trouble? George looked about in wild surprise. It was the gray-haired man who had been sitting next to him. Gray hair nodded benignly at George. Guest? Was he mad? The policeman was saying, These two were creating a disturbance, sir. Any criminal charges? Any damages? No, sir. Well, then, I'll be responsible. He presented a small card to the policeman's view, and the latter stepped back at once. Trevelyan began indignantly. Hold on now. But the policeman turned on him. All right now, got any charges? On your way. The rest of you, move on. A sizable crowd had gathered, which now reluctantly unknotted itself and raveled away. George let himself be led to the skimmer, but balked at entering. He said, Thank you, but I'm not your guest. Could it be a ridiculous case of mistaken identity? But Gray Hair smiled and said, You weren't, but you are now. Let me introduce myself. I'm Ladislas Ingenescu. Oh, that's a cool name. Ladislas Ingenescu, registered historian. But come now. You will come to no harm, I assure you. After all, I only wanted to spare you some trouble with a policeman. But why? Do you want a reason? Well then, let's say that we're honorary townsmates, you and I. We both shouted for the same man, remember? And we townspeople must stick together, even if the tie is only honorary, eh? And George, completely unsure of this man, Ingenescu, and of himself as well, found himself inside the skimmer before he could make up his mind that he ought to get out again. They were off the ground. He thought confusedly, the man has some status. The policeman deferred to him. He was almost forgetting that his real purpose here in San Francisco was not to find Trevelyan, but to find some person with enough influence to force a reappraisal of his own capacity of education. It could be that Ingenescu was such a man, and right in George's lap. Everything could be working out fine, yet it sounded hollow in his thought. He was uneasy.